Hi, I'm Corey Wayne, and the video that you're about to watch is one that we filmed back in, like, I think it was end of November of 2023. And Eric Blandford, IraqVet8888, has got a big YouTube channel, pro-gun, Gun Owners of America, does lobbying efforts, is, putting a lot of time and effort in basically lawfare and going after and helping to sue the federal government to get these unconstitutional gun laws overturned. And so his background is he was in the army and served in Iraq. I forget how many combat tours that he had over there. But this discussion we were talking about Avdiivka, and a lot of what's interesting is we're basically giving the West is, including the United States, our best equipment and our best gear to basically so the Ukrainians can test it out. Because I mean, from a strategic perspective, it would make sense to take your best stuff that hasn't been tested, give a few systems to the Ukrainians, and have them put it up against the best that Russia's got. Because hopefully it should be better kit, better weapons, better air defenses, and figure out ways to defeat it. Plus, give the Russians the opportunity to try to see if they can defeat our electronic warfare and some of our air defenses that we've given them. And so in this discussion, we were talking about Avdiivka, and there was some kind of, because I've been reading about this, Michael Kaufman's been real good about, because he actually goes over there. If you guys are interested in somebody that's actually goes there and talks to the people on the ground, talks to the people running the war, and he's been pretty accurate, pretty honest, where things are good, bad, and different, and so we were talking about this pocket in Avdiivka back in November that had been created, and so they had brought up a electronic warfare system of some kind. It was basically able to jam all of the Russians' drones and probably even some of their aircraft, and they also brought up some air defenses. So I know the Germans gave the Ukrainians a truck-mounted Patriot missile battery, air defense type of battery, and because these systems are in short supply and the West is not, we're not like giving them hundreds of these things. It's like a handful of these individual systems plus older systems that they're basically connecting together, and so there was a pocket that had been created, and you guys will see that as we go through it, because in this past week, about a week and a half ago, Avdiivka, the Ukrainians slowly withdrew, and there were some reports that the Russians were actually able to even bring up some air support to attack the Ukrainians as they were retreating. Because in the past, when they first opened up this pocket, I think they had one of the, they brought one of the Patriot batteries up, and they shot down several aircraft. They shot down some helicopters. And so what they seem to be doing is kind of moving this Patriot air battery around because it's truck mounted. And just the other day, they shot down 3 planes. I think it's the Su-34, if I'm not mistaken, the fighter bomber. Shot down like 3 of them. And so what they do is they bring these things up, turn the radar on, see where all the planes are, and then shoot the missiles off, and then close down the battery and then take off and move to a new location. And so the missile systems move into a different location when the missiles are still on their way to the target, and it shot 3 planes down.
It's a smart way to avoid getting bombed.
Yeah. So because then you get because once it takes off, the Russians have counter battery fire, and they can detect where it took off from and then launch counter artillery. And if you're still in the same spot, you're going to get blown up. And so it's like, shoot and scoot, basically. Shoot your missiles off at the planes because it's a fire and forget type of missile system. And then you can move the launch vehicle and the radar and haul ass out of there. And so the Ukrainians withdrew because it was kind of not a good from a defensive position, because their whole strategy is now shifting to a strictly defensive strategy. And because you got a lot of the pro-Ukrainian people that are screaming for more artillery, more missiles, more air defense, give them the F-16s, give them more main battle tanks, more Bradleys, give them more everything. And we've been going through our stockpiles, and the thing that was shocking to me about this whole thing is in the 1990s, our capacity to make artillery was like, I think it was 155 millimeter. Was like we had the capacity to make 900,000 rounds per month. And when the war started, we were only making, I think it was like 12 or 14,000 rounds a month. That was our capacity. And when you're in a war, you can literally shoot hundreds of thousands of rounds, especially if you got a lot of artillery and a lot of tubes shooting it. You can go through thousands and thousands and thousands of ammunition in a matter of days, basically. And I remember reading that they had something like the capacity to fire something like 450,000 rounds a month, but they only were getting enough ammunition for about 200,000 rounds a month.
That's
and
still a
then,
lot of rounds, though, too.
So in the defense authorization bill, there was, I think it was $6 billion that was allocated for a new artillery plant. I think it's in Texas. It's being built. And so when that thing's completed and it comes online sometime early 2025, that should get our artillery monthly capacity for new shells up to 100,000 rounds a month. And so, because the Russians have the same problem, is like they're dipping in their stockpiles. Now North Korea's giving them a bunch of ammunition. And so that's part of the problem, is that the West has let their capacity to make ammunition totally atrophy. And so the demands of a conventional type of war, basically everybody's going through their stockpiles. You got South Korea sending their stockpiles over. I think it was Denmark, the prime minister. She was just on an interview recently. Last year, they gave the Ukrainians every single piece of all the artillery that they had, because they're like, hey, we're not going to need it. So their whole stockpile of artillery they gave to them.
Yeah.
Plus, I think they had 19 Caesar 155 millimeters. This was a truck-mounted howitzer, automatic loading type of system. It's really accurate because you can pull up on station, dig into the ground, mount, pull the gun up, point it where it's supposed to go, load your rounds, fire, 4 or 5 rounds, and then the rounds are still in the air on their way to target, and you pack up and then you haul ass before their counter battery can fire back. But I think it was like 19. They had 19 systems total in their whole arsenal. So they basically gave them all the artillery, the Ukrainians all the artillery that they had. So they got nothing now, and they don't really have a capacity. So now they're going to wait several years to get replacement artillery systems for that. And it just, that's the big thing that wins wars is logistics. And one of the things that Michael Kaufman has been reporting on, because obviously the offensive culminated and it really didn't accomplish a lot. And it's like some of the areas the Russians are probably going to end up retaking a lot of that area back. But what you see is, a lot of people in the West screaming about more artillery, more this, more that, send them more cluster munitions, more missiles. They want them to send more cruise missiles, that kind of thing. They also have the Army Tactical Missile System, which, they've got, I think, 3,000 or 4,000 of these things that are even like pre-GPS. And so those are those big missiles that have the bomblets in them. I think it has, one of them has up to 900 grenades in essence, and they're great because for bombing an airfield where you got all your helicopters and stuff parked, and they have used them in the war, but we only have a few thousand of them total in the stockpile, and Biden's been very stingy, and I think he gave them 20 or 25 total, and so they used them and took out a bunch of those. I think it was the Ka-52, 54, 52 attack helicopter that the Russians have. They basically perforated all of them, and some of them were completely destroyed because they were, causing a lot of problems for the Ukrainians during the counteroffensive. And so you got people that are pro-Ukraine are like, well, give them what they need to win. And, there was I think it was $4 billion in Lend-Lease money that wasn't even used. There was a lot of money that even the Republicans gave Biden to use, and he just refused to send them the stuff. He could send the Ukrainians what he needs or what they need to win. But when you listen to Jake Sullivan, who works for Joe Biden, there's been some talks or interviews where he's on stage with 4 or 5 other people, and they're talking about Ukraine and what their strategy is. And when you listen to Jake Sullivan talk, he's the guy that's running the war for Joe Biden, because you get people in the West who are like, what are you doing? Send them the stuff they need to win. It's like they're sending the Ukrainians enough to not lose, but not enough to win or give them a decisive advantage. And then after you watch some of these videos they're floating around on Twitter where Jake Sullivan's being interviewed, and they're asking him, what's going on? What's the strategy? Why don't you send him more stuff? And their whole strategy is they're trying to attrit the Russian forces. In other words, they're basically trying to murder as many Russian troops as possible. And when you look at the Russian army, the Russian military, their special forces that they started the war with 2 years ago, versus now, I mean, most of those guys are killed, and even they were taking a lot of their military trainers and people in the rear that they needed and sending them to the front lines because they needed bodies and they needed people that knew how to fight when things were going really bad. And so most of their best troops have been killed or too severely wounded to return to combat and sent back home. And the same thing for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian losses are something like, I've seen estimates like 70 to 80% of what the Russians have lost. And when you look at the amount of killed in action that Russia has now, it's over 400,000 of their troops have been killed in action. And when you think about the whole Afghan war for Russia, they lost I think it was 33,000 total. That was their Vietnam. The United States during World War II, we lost 400,000 troops in that war. And the Russians have already surpassed that in the special military operation. So it's just absolute carnage in this war. And they're thinking, the Biden administration is basically, we're killing all their best and most experienced troops, and we're also destroying their best and their most advanced equipment. And so that what you're seeing now versus like when the war started out is they're going into stockpiles and they're pulling tanks, that were made in the 40s and the 50s in some cases out of storage, even some of their artillery, just because they need material. APCs, armored personnel carriers. I mean, some of them they're upgrading and modernizing a little bit, put new engines and stuff like that, or new guns on it, or whatever. But that's the whole goal. They're giving the Ukrainians enough to keep them from losing, but they're basically trying to keep the war going so they could just slowly murder as many of the Russian troops as possible and weaken the Russian military and destroy as many of their advanced air defense systems, their armored personnel carriers, their tanks, their vehicles, their fuel trucks, just destroy as much of it as they can. And so when you hear this guy talk, then you go, okay, because everybody's so frustrated, right? The Republicans like, we need to stop this war. And then everybody on the left is like, we need to get what they need to win. And then when you listen to Jake Sullivan, it's like he's dragging it on purpose. His goal is just strictly to murder as many of the Russian troops as possible and drag it out for as long as possible to eliminate as many Russian men and material and their equipment and their stockpiles of ammunition, even though we're going through our own as well. And so Avdiivka has now fallen, and so the line is going to straighten out along there. But I was reading reports that we were talking about this Russian mill blogger yesterday, that he reported that the Russians they'd lost 16,000 troops just trying to retake Avdiivka, and there are estimates that the actual number of killed in action is somewhere around 30,000. And what's his name? Prigozhin, Yuri Prigozhin, before he got shot out of the air by an air defense missile, he was saying that the Russian losses were 3 or 4 times what the Russian Ministry of Defense had reported. And so when you looked at that and you take that into consideration with what the Ukrainians had reported, it makes sense. And so back to this Russian mill blogger, he reports that there's basically 16,000 killed in action Russians. And so the Russian Ministry of Defense said, you need to take that report down. And so they made him take it down, and then he committed suicide, apparently.
Wow. They still got him. That's insane. Even after taking it down.
So you either get arrested or you get suicided. There's lots of people that have spoken out against the war or said the wrong thing, and they end up falling out of hospital windows, or they're smoking a cigarette on the balcony at a hospital or whatever, and they fall out, or they're at their apartment and they fall out of their window, or they're at an office building and they fall out of a window. That seems to be something that the Russians like to do to send a message with Yuri Prigozhin. That
they sent a big message with that.
Yeah, they use the air defense to shoot his ass out of the air and say, "Oh, it was just a mistake. The air defense accidentally went off and shot him out of the air." And it was a message because it was revenge because there was I think it was an electronics countermeasure plane that he ended up shooting down. I think he shot down a couple of these are Russian attack helicopters, and so they killed, I don't know, 12 or 18 Russian Air Force guys that they shot out of the sky with their air defenses.
Yeah.
This was Wagner. They used their air defenses to shoot down Russians, and so the Russian military used an air defense to shoot Prigozhin, his private jet, out of the air. And I mean, just the whole war is crazy. And then if you watch the Tucker interview, it's pretty clear that Putin, he wants Ukraine back. And if you study the history of Ukraine, you know that Russia was basically founded in Kiev, or Kiev, I guess the way you're supposed to pronounce it. And so he said many times, this is on video, and he's been saying it for decades, that Ukraine's not really a state. It shouldn't be a state. It should have never been a state. He didn't like the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's pretty obvious that he's trying to regather and reconstitute as much of that as possible, especially while Biden is in office. Because when he attacked Ukraine in 2014, when Obama was in office, all he did was issue strongly worded letters and didn't do shit other than sending some more weapons and stuff like that. And so now that they're shifting to a strictly defensive strategy, it doesn't look like there's going to be any kind of counteroffensive or anything, obviously, in 2025, because they're trying to reconstitute combat power, trying to get more supplies. The F-16s are supposed to be coming online, but they keep slow rolling those because the F-16s will give them a significant advantage. And then just earlier today, I was reading, those the AWACS, the most advanced type of Russian. If you ever seen those big giant AWACS that the Americans have, with that giant rotating dish on top, one of those just got shot out of the air either this morning or yesterday by that mobile Patriot battery, because they brought that up and they were kind of tracking and watching that thing, and then they shot that out of the sky, and apparently that was the last one they had that was operational and flying condition that the Russians have. So this, again, you give them enough to just absolutely wreck shop on the Russians. I don't know if you guys saw maybe you can put that clip of that Bradley fighting vehicle shooting its 25 millimeter cannon at the Russian T-90 main battle tank and just fucking wrecking shop on it. You remember that one?
Yeah.
So that'd be cool if you can overlay that and post and show that. And so that's the whole philosophy. The Ukrainians are not going to be given what they need to win. They're going to be given what they need to maintain the war, to kill as many Russians and, unfortunately, Ukrainians as possible, and all in order to weaken what is considered a peer-to-peer opponent. Because, again, didn't Russia say they had the second most powerful or strongest military in the world or something like that?
How long do you think the war goes on for? How long do you think it gets dragged out?
I think Joe Biden will just drag it on until next year, even, the Trump administration. I assume he'll end up getting elected, and knowing Trump, what he will probably do is he'll probably say something along the lines of, I'm going to give the Ukrainians whatever they need to completely cut you guys off in the South. I'm going to give the Ukrainians what the Biden administration was not willing to do. So your whole southern command gets cut off, and then they'll have plenty of missiles to take out the Kerch Bridge. And so that'll the only way you'll be able to resupply Crimea and southern command is going to be through over the water. And that hasn't been working out too well for the Russian Navy because of all the remote-controlled boat bombs that they're out there. They've sunk another Russian corvette in the ocean. It was last week or the week before, with some remote control little boats that have bombs on it. And so if you think about it, because the material is there, I mean, it's pretty obvious that the Western gear, the Western equipment is far superior to anything that the Russians have. But they're not being given what they need in quantities to decisively win, decisively cut them off. And again, if you listen to Jake Sullivan, the video's out there. He's been interviewed several times on it. He has no problem talking about their strategy. So that's a strategy. And that's the way it is, and it does not look like it's going to change. Despite the circus that's going on with Congress and the funding and all of this shit, the stockpiles are there. Biden has the authority, if he wants to send the stuff that the Ukrainians need. Plus, whether it's Denmark or any of our other allies give like F-16s or other kit that they bought from us to the Ukrainians, we have to sign off on it. And so that's another thing. Jake Sullivan is not signing off on equipment that the Ukrainians desperately need because, again, that's not he believes it will give the Ukrainians too much of a decisive advantage and push or escalate the war a little bit more in the Ukrainians' favor. And again, he wants to keep it festering, keep it going, to kill as many Russians as possible. So I don't see that changing until Trump comes in. But that's what he'll say. He'll give them what they need to where Putin realizes he's going to lose all the South there, and that will give the Ukrainians what they need to negotiate. But he's
Yeah, I
not
don't
going
know
to
how
just
many.
fold up tent and
Yeah,
let Putin take Ukraine, despite what he says. If you look what he did when he was in office, he was the one that gave them all the javelins that they used to stop the Ukrainian or the Russian invasion when they invaded Ukraine. So that's what I think is going to happen. But anyways, that was a long diatribe, and I wanted to kind of go because it's been almost 3 months since we originally filmed this, but it was a fun discussion with Eric. But I mean, the Ukrainians could win. We have the ability to give them what they need to win, but they're not being given what they need to win on purpose. Because again, if you listen to Jake Sullivan, who runs the war for Joe Biden, they just want to kill as many Russians as possible and drag it out as long as possible. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, whatever you want to call it, because they're going through all their stockpiles, even their old equipment. They're going through all of it, and it'll take years and years to rebuild that back up. So from a strategic perspective,
yeah, it's just crippling Russia.
it's a good thing to do from a strategic or a military perspective. Is it a nice thing to do? Obviously not. I mean, war is awful. I mean, I've with all of the drone footage and all of the battles that I've watched, whether it's just I've seen thousands of Russians and thousands of Ukrainians murdering each other and up close and personal with guns, with bombs, with vehicles. It's just, I mean, it's so up close and in your face, the footage that's out there. It has an effect on you. It's like when you see that much carnage and death, it's like, especially the one, maybe you can add this video in there too. There was a couple weeks ago, there was a Russian, I think it might have been in Avdiivka, if I'm not mistaken. It had a mine plow on it, and he hit a mine and it blew the track off his tank and disabled his tank. And so this guy got out of his tank, and he can't really go anywhere or run anywhere because he's in the middle of a minefield. So if he runs away from the tank, or he could step on a mine and blow himself up, and then he just turns into a pink ball of mist. There'll be nothing left of him. And so what happens is an FPV drone, which is a first-person drone, which is like you get the goggles and you can fly it with your phone in essence or remote control. It's the kind of drone you buy on Amazon, and it's got a bomb attached to it. And so a Ukrainian pilot is, in essence, chasing this Russian. And so he's kind of hiding under the cannon, and he's got some camo netting. And then he starts kind of trying to run in a circle away from it, and it just, the bomb gets his ass. It's awful. It's awful to see that. These are, this is the flower of Russian and Ukrainian youth are just absolutely slaughtering each other by the tens of thousands. It's like, for what? What is going to be the net effect of it? So a bunch of oligarchs can play Monopoly on a chessboard.
They have all the rights to all the stuff to build a bit. Like when they have to build back after the war, they're going to own it.
Well, everything's destroyed.
Yeah.
The city, Avdiivka, is totally destroyed. Bakhmut, we were talking about that. Is everywhere the Russians have taken, they've just mostly completely destroyed it. And on top of that, you got all this unexploded ordnance, you got unexploded mines, and for the next 50, 100 years, people and kids are going to come across these unexploded ammunition. They're going to blow themselves up, blow their hands off, blow their legs off, cripple themselves. It's that sucks for the future. But even if the Russians take a big portion of it, it's still a lot of innocent people are going to be getting killed for decades because of all the unexploded ordnance and booby traps and other things that are going to be left out there, whether it's in the buildings or in the fields or in the trenches or any of that stuff. So, but anyways, I hope you guys enjoy. But again, what we're talking about, that was the picture back in November. So it's interesting 3 months later. And now we have, Jake Sullivan basically saying that they're just going to slowly attrit the Russians. And so it's going to be like this. It's not really going to go anywhere. Just a lot of people are going to be dying.
There's a lot of videos floating around of Bradleys. So we sent Ukraine Bradleys, and I know the Germans sent Leopard tanks. So there's a lot of material coming from the West to the Ukraine in order for them to fight a war against Russia and everything. And we see videos where, this is reportedly this is a blown up Leopard 2, or this is a blown up Bradley fighting vehicle, or it's a blown up, American tank or American piece of hardware or something like that. That very well may be true, right? Like I've seen some mangled wreckage. Like, yeah, the Russians have destroyed some American equipment, but I believe
The crew survived.
What you wind up finding out is that the crew often survives, and that is the thing. You cannot. It is impossible to recover that experience back.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time to train men back up.
Yeah, it's far easier to replace equipment than people.
And then also,
And they're able to fix that equipment too eventually.
yes, they've got repair facilities set up. See, look at the logistics of how they handle war losses on the Ukrainian side versus the Russian side. The Russians are like, oh,
They're doing meat assaults.
they're blown up, they're gone. Oh, we lost 12 BMPs trying to, go take this little village. It has no strategic value.
Avdiivka.
Avdiivka, yes. And we're going into Avdiivka and lost 12 BMPs, and the crews and everything, and all the ground infantry, like dead, gone.
They've had days where
And
they're
their
losing.
only recourse is to go, well, dig some more old ass BMPs out of storage that barely run. Well, it doesn't matter if they barely run; they only got to make it right there. That's not the mindset of abundance you want to have in a war fighting capability. To spread yourself out like that. So also, the West is doing, it's quite clever. Maybe this is something people haven't thought about. Maybe they have. I'm sure they have. There's something I think about. Is, yeah, German gave those Leopard 2s. We gave the Bradleys. We gave some, I think we're doing some slightly older Abrams packages. Like maybe not the
And
new fancy
strikers.
armor.
We send them a lot of strikers.
Maybe not the fancy new armor, but we're sending some Abrams, and we're sending strikers, which, look, my experience with the striker in Iraq was that it was a major piece of shit. But, however, when properly maintained and with good parts support, pretty solid vehicle. It's got its place, right? But what is the West doing? The West is fielding their equipment against the Russians and letting the Ukrainians test it out and see how it holds up against the Russians.
That's smart.
So it's smart on the Germans to go, oh, yeah, we'll give you some Leopard 2s. And they're going, we'll see how well the Russians do against those. And, of course, they're training the crews. They give them every best opportunity, not just throwing some conscript in a tank and going, here's the button, here's the gas. No, they're getting training. Like, it takes time to train a tank crew, especially on an unfamiliar system that they don't even know about. I mean, a lot of the Ukrainian tank crews know how to run T-72s because that's like the Mattel toy of tanks over there. Like, the T-72s are everywhere. In Iraq, there are giant fields of T-72s that get blown up and complete graveyards full of BMPs and T-72s that we destroyed in the Gulf War. Like, I've been to the graveyard where they're at. As far as I can see, there's T-72s destroyed. They're disposable tanks for disposable soldiers.
Because
The
the
T-72
soldiers
is a common
don't matter.
tank.
During World War II, when during the siege of Stalingrad, they didn't have enough rifles to give to the Russian troops, and so what they did is they took broomsticks and painted them black, and so they would do basically meat assaults. And if somebody that had a rifle gets killed, then the only way you could get a rifle if you got a broomstick is to pick up a rifle from somebody that was dead. And you saw the same thing in Bakhmut. When the Russians took Bakhmut, they were sending these. They went to all these guys that are in jail for life or whatever and said, "Hey, if you can survive 6 months in country, then your record will be expunged and you'll be a free man." And so they were doing these meat assaults, and because the regular Russian army would send these prisoners in their gear to charge at the Ukrainians, so the Ukrainians would fire on them, and then the Russians could figure out where the Ukrainians were at, and they get killed by the tens of thousands. I mean, Prigozhin, before he got shot out of the sky, was talking about how, I mean, this is all on video. You can see the video, and it's all translated on. It's been on Twitter ever since it happened. But he said the actual numbers of Russian killed in action is 3-4 times what was officially being put out. And then when you looked at that, lining up with what the Ukrainians had been saying were killed in action Russian-wise, it totally lined up.
But in terms of war math, that is an optimal outcome for the Ukrainians.
Yep.
As long as you're exacting 3-to-1 rate of casualties, I mean, preferably as much as you can. I mean, obviously, if you're losing casualties, if you are accepting casualties at a 1-to-1 rate, that's not a paradigm for success. what we teach in the West is as a 3-to-1 fire superiority. If we're going to take an objective, right, and we know there's 2,000 enemy, we're going to bring 6,000 to their 2,000. We're going to have a 3-to-1 fire superiority over them. And then the acceptable loss might be that, yeah, we may lose, a third of our men, but the idea is that because we have 3-to-1 fire superiority and exceptional tactics and planning and logistics and, of course we have our shit together, well, then the idea is that the overwhelming force will win the day and our good tactics and planning and everything will have us come out on top. But even if all of those things fall apart, every plan falls through, something happens, there's a kink in the armor, well, you still have 3-to-1 fire superiority. You will take the day. You will win the day. It might cost you. And we learned that in Korea. We learned that in Vietnam. I mean, look, it's all classically been dealt with in American doctrine for years. Is that whole 3-to-1 fire superiority that you want to try to maintain? And who do you think is training the Ukrainians on what to do, how to plan battles, how to collect your intelligence and figure out how you're going to get your marching orders together and conduct an operation, what that operation's going to be?
Then we started back, what was it, 2014? We've been training, equipping, advising, mentoring the Ukrainian military for almost a decade now.
Yeah. So they got good training.
And when you look at the influence of the American soldier, the American fighting man and woman globally with our allies, you look at like Egypt. We've been training, equipping, mentoring, advising the Egyptian military for decades. And when the revolution happened, 2010, 2011, the most respected institution in Egypt was what? Their military. Who mentored, trained them, equipped them? Our guys did. Same thing with Saudi Arabia. Same thing now with the Iraqis. And globally, we've been training, mentoring, and so when you look at like what happened with the Egyptian revolution, what kept the country together was the military. And again, that's part of the influence of our foreign policy. So because our guys basically lived and slept alongside and worked alongside and bled alongside and sweat alongside these other troops from other countries, it's part of our value system gets transferred and passed on to them. Our doctrine gets passed on to them.
And they also see our work ethic.
Yes.
They look at us and they go, wow, like these Americans aren't lazy. Like, they actually do know what they're talking about. Like, wow, these folks know how to fight. Like, wow, they're strong. Look at them. Like, you carry that with you. You carry who you are into every situation that you put yourself in. And trust me, people pay attention to that. I mean,
Look at the Ukrainians. I'm sure a lot of those dudes that were working in an office, working in a coffee shop, that in a matter of weeks were on the front lines with a pistol, a rifle, and they probably, none of them had ever had any training, much less probably learn to handle those weapons. And you're not going to learn what you need to learn in a couple of weeks to become really super competent and safe with those. It's like, and then you're going up against potentially Russian special forces or just their regular army that actually have training and professionalism. And it's like, I'm sure a lot of those Ukrainian dudes would have really have liked to have grown up with guns, learned to handle them, had them, owned them, knew how to shoot, hunt, all those things with them, because they go from the office to the front lines in a matter of weeks, and a lot of those dudes just got slaughtered because they didn't know how to defend themselves.
Right. I know that there were, grandmas making Molotov cocktails out in the streets.
Yep.
So, they were handing out pamphlets and handing out rifles. I mean, the government in Kyiv started taking rifles and handing them out to civilians in order to defend the city.
Isn't that kind of funny that was heavily applauded, that we're giving weapons to all these people, but the same people, the same politicians and the same people that vote a certain way were like, oh, we can't have the guns ourselves, but like, oh, we must give the Ukrainians these guns because they needed. They don't really see the irony.
Got to have them, but not us.
Yeah.
Once they think that their ass is in the sling, everything changes.
But that's too late. That's the problem. That's the irony of it. Like, they're trained
when Russia invades your country and you've never had any experience with firearms, and just because of the nature of the sudden invasion, you're not going through boot camp and going to spend a year and a half training and learning to be a soldier or Marine or whatever. It's like
you're gonna have to figure it out.
In a matter of weeks, you're right there in the front lines getting blown up and shot at.
And you have to figure it out.
Yep. Or you're
And some
dead.
of them did.
Yeah.
I'm sure some of them, adapted. I wouldn't put it past them. I mean, they're pretty wily people. I mean, they seem to, be pretty tenacious. I mean, look at the farmers like toting off tanks and artillery pieces, like capturing Russian equipment with like their freaking tractors and stuff, and dragging them back to the Ukrainians. It was like, they've done some pretty courageous stuff. So I'd venture to say they probably do a little better than one might think. Maybe they would actually fare quite well. I think I got a little more faith in them than that. I mean, they did do really good. I mean, like they repelled the Russians.
Yep.
They beat them. Victory's victory, right? Doesn't matter how it happens.
Fought them to a stalemate, basically, and now they're just attriting them.
Yeah, doesn't matter how it happens at the end. Who did it? I mean, just give everybody credit. People that volunteered, the military. I mean, it was just a group effort. It's just crazy to think about how badly that column got destroyed. Like, they lost a lot of people in that first, initial part of the invasion.
Yeah, I remember seeing the video and the pictures of some of those, because a lot of those vehicles were just stored out in the sun, and so the tires had dry rotted, and you just see them where they just disintegrated and fell apart, and they just had to completely abandon that multi-million-dollar air defense system on the side of the road or whatever. Or they had to call them because they've been told that, I mean, they're not even going to fight. In 3 days, the war will be over. And so they drive in this long column, and, you shoot the front vehicle and disable it. You shoot the back vehicle, and now everybody's stuck. And you pick them off at your leisure, whether artillery or javelins or whatever.
Just like in Finland on the logging trails in World War II.
Yep.
Same thing.
It was weird. I mean, you think about any major city, like, one in Florida is like Federal Highway. And, Federal Highway goes, all the way through the state. It's usually all up and down the whole state of Florida. It's a busy metropolitan area like that. Or some places are a little more rural and there's houses alongside the road. Mostly it's businesses and stuff, or a combination of both. And just imagine a, big long column of military vehicles, and then you disable the ones in the front and the back, and it was amazing just seeing all these vehicles just blown up in the street. Tanks, APCs just mangled and ripped in half. Tank turrets thrown up and landing on top of houses or buildings. Dead bodies everywhere, dead Russians everywhere. And they took such heavy losses, they had to stop their march on Kyiv. They couldn't, and plus their logistics were overstretched, so they couldn't support their army.
Did you ever recall seeing those crematory trailers that they were pulling around, like mobile crematory?
Yeah, because they had so many dead, they were having to cremate them.
Yeah.
And probably that, like we were talking about earlier, like because there's a lot of Russian families, like they have no word, they have no idea what happened to their family member. And I see a lot of cases, it's like the Russians, they don't even give a shit about each other. It's like you see groups of them getting attacked, and then you got one guy, he's laying there, and he's been hit, and they just walk around him. They don't even try to give him any assist, just walk around him and just let him bleed to death, not even try to help him. Just, going about their business. And it's
completely strange.
And they just leave the bodies there, and then the dude dies right there, and then, the Russians are still 15, 20 feet away in their trenches, and they didn't even bother going and getting the guy, and they just let him die, and then he just sits there and rots in the sun, and just dozens of bodies of their comrades just laying everywhere, rotting, stinking, and they don't do nothing about it. They don't even try to recover them. They just leave them there.
Wow. It's fucked up, isn't it?
Yeah.
They might try to recover the guns. Pull the guns off of them, recover the equipment.
There's just no regard for each other's lives. They just don't care. And I saw a video also of a bunch of Russians that were, they got overrun, and so they were running back to the back lines, and the Russian regular 3 guys come out, and there's probably like 8 or 10 guys running, and they didn't even they ran away so quickly they didn't even take their weapons. And these guys are like waving at them, hey, where are your comrades? And they got up close and they just killed them all. Shot them, and then went over and put a couple rounds in their head. Because they had been told, hey, you can't surrender, you can't retreat. I mean, the Russian army did that to their own troops in World War II. They said, hey, here, we don't have enough weapons, here's broomsticks. You need a charge up there, and if you want a gun, you pick one up from somebody that's dead, that actually had a gun.
It's that same thing, too. It's like they ran back instantly
Yeah,
shot.
and
Just kill 'em.
they had machine guns set up, so if the troops start running, they'll shoot and kill their own guys. And I watched the Russians do it in Ukraine when these guys were retreating. That they said that you got to hold the line. It's either you die or you hold the line. And then when they went off running back to the back lines, they all got mowed down by their own dudes, just assassinated. And then the guy they calmly walked back to their trench lines and just left the dudes' bodies there to rot. They didn't bother picking them up.
Wow.
No regard for their lives at all.
Damn.
You know one of the things Sun Tzu said was, when armies are evenly matched, the one with compassion wins.
I think the Ukrainians have more compassion than that. I mean, come on.
Yep.
Dang.
But you can see it. Somebody gets wounded, they're usually sending 2 Bradleys to go pick those guys up.
Very Western doctrine.
Yep.
Overpowering recovery and aid.
Yep.
Aid and litter and getting them out and making that process where they're real well protected and there's good security and good operational security, good communication, everyone's pulling security. It's a well organized operation, not just, hey Jimmy, come bring the meat wagon over. No, I mean, like, it's very specific. You got to follow a certain route and call in, say, hey, we're on the way, communicate everything. The last thing you want to do is shoot your own people when they're pulling up,
Yep.
in the confusion. So it's well articulated and communicated to each other, and much more of a Western doctrine where everything is very organized and very methodical and very carefully done, whereby theirs is just utter chaos, like 2 totally, completely different ways of thinking of warfare, for sure. The Russians seem to have like very little discipline when it comes to, thinking about things logically, like the Ukrainians do.
It's a tragedy of epic proportions.
Yeah. Some heavy stuff, man. It's been a really rough war for them.
It's tough to watch that because there's so much gore on Twitter, but it's like, if you want to see what happens and kind of understand it, and it's like, you're going to get exposed to that shit.
How much longer do you think it's going to be going on?
I don't know. Like we were talking about earlier, it just seems like Joe Biden is slow rolling the ammunition and the stuff that they need, whether it's the F-16s. They were supposed to have that new glide bomb that was would go in the HIMARS tubes or the HIMARS launchers that gets like double the range, and we were so the contract, I don't know, Boeing or somebody I think makes those. They're ready to deploy them, and they're good to go. We're ready to send them to Ukraine. They were supposed to be in Ukraine by December, and the Pentagon goes, we want to test it for a little while longer. And so now it's January, February. It's like, they fucking need them now.
For sure.
It's like you're. So I look at stupid shit like that. It's the contractor came through and got it done early, and it's ready to be deployed on the front lines, and they need it, and they don't get it. This just means more Ukrainians dead, more Russians dead, and I look at that and it just seems like they want to kill as many Ukrainian and Russian men as possible. Just let them bleed each other out as long as they can. Give the Ukrainians enough to keep them from losing, but not enough to win decisively. And it's, because you see it, you read in the press, and Zelensky he's done a great job being a wartime president for his country, and he's just constantly, in essence, fundraising and, asking for material and help, and he's getting a lot of it, but there's a lot of things that they should have. I've been reading that we've got always like 1,000, 1,500 old Bradleys that we could send over there, that we're paying $40,000, $50,000, I think, a piece, to basically demilitarize and then scrap them and sell the metal. It's like, that's fucking stupid.
Yeah. And
we're just destroying these things, which we should be keeping in the first place. And they could really use them, because when they need to evac people out, one of the first things they send in is a Bradley. Those are saving a lot of lives over there, a lot of Ukrainian lives. And like you were talking about, they're being very methodical. They're just trying to slowly attrit because they can't get the stuff that they really need to really go full out at the Russians to break through the lines. So they're just trying to slowly pick off every piece of air defense. I've seen some of the air defenses that the Russians have that are painted in like winter type of camouflage showing up in Crimea, and obviously that means that they're they're taking air defenses from other places because they're getting destroyed. Where they got the beachhead, because the Russians are complaining they can't get any counter battery fire. It's the Ukrainians are because they brought up artillery now, and so they're able to hit the Russians, and so with the electronic warfare and the air defense that they've got, it's like the Russians try to hit them and they just can't. They're outranged with the Western artillery outranges what they have. So, because they've had to back all their artillery and stuff up. And so they're slowly moving in, and it's like that's an area because of the river that, the Russians didn't, have huge minefields, and there's not a lot of defenses that, the Russian defenses are really thin in that area because they'd never expected them to come through. But when they blew the dam, and a lot of places, it washed all their minefields away too. And so they have a bunch of equipment that, is good for getting across like swampy areas. Plus,
just wait till all people start finding the mines in the river downstream.
Yeah.
Years from now.
Yeah.
We have to clean all that up.
So they're talking about because they only, I don't know, I guess they have a limited number of like the pontoon bridges, and so they don't want to bring those up and build them and then have the Russians blow them up because they don't have any more. And but to bring in the armor and stuff they want, I've been reading that they said they need like 5 of them in place to be able to bring everything forward they need, plus to be able to continue to supply a force that big, so they can make their way through the Russian rear and cut them off completely, cut off all the rails, cut off all the roads, and get to the Sea of Azov, and the whole southern Russia is like they're cut off, and then when they get to the Sea of Azov, then they can take out the Kerch Bridge, and so the only way they're completely cut off.
They can cut them off,
and they only have like supposedly 3 or 4 days of ammunition. The Russians do, and it's like so you're getting no food, you're getting no medical evacuation, you're getting no more ammunition, and you're getting no more fuel. So you're within a few days, all your vehicles are bricked.
I bet the troops down there are on edge. Those guys that are left, the Russians, I bet they feel like they're about to get hemmed up.
I think there's like 70 to 80,000 of them in the south, isn't there? Is that how many Russians are deployed down there?
Those guys are going to get their asses handed to them. That's going to be a fucking bloodbath.
But, all war is deception, so maybe the appearance of slow rolling of, because oftentimes when, the Americans say, okay, now we're sending these things, they've already had it for weeks. It was like the HIMARS, we're going to send 5, and then when you look at the numbers of crews that were trained, because that was published, you're like, that's like 55 vehicles. And then 6 months later, you find out that they already got 50 of those systems, and you're like, ah. So, supposedly we're sending them old generation F-16 jets, and their radar has less of a range than the Russians have in their most advanced fighters. I'm thinking, well, that's kind of fucking stupid. You're asking for them to get shot down basically because the Russians can see them before they can see the Russians, unless they're having modifications or. I mean,
surely they have better radar for them.
The smart thing to do is to send our most advanced, or give them a handful of our most advanced F-16s and see what the fuck they can do. Yeah, because we got a new one that just rolled out, and they've got all these new electronic warfare and jamming pods and stuff like that. It's like, let's see if it works. I've seen Russian channels, bloggers, complaining that the West is sending all of their latest weapons to basically test them on them, to test killing them better and more efficiently, and it's very upsetting and demoralizing to them, obviously.